Welcome to the Hidden Potential Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Hargrove. And in today's episode, we have a special conversation with Chuck Skarin about building leaders. He's a good friend of mine and even an old boss. Chuck has initiated and led various ministry sites spanning diverse settings from rural areas to mid-sized cities and is currently leading as the Chief Ministry Officer at Southwest Texas Youth for Christ in San Antonio, Texas. This diverse experience has brought him into close collaboration with individuals, volunteers, and staff from nearly every generation and a multitude of ethnic backgrounds. Through these experiences, he has not only acquired valuable skills and knowledge, but also demonstrated a consistent track record of effective leadership. His focus has always been on developing leaders and equipping them to, in turn, nurture more leaders. He has also just released a book on leadership called Atomic Leadership. Let's get started. Thanks again for taking the time to talk with me, Chuck, to kind of give our audience a better idea of who you are. Can you kind of describe what it is that you do currently?
Yeah, so right now I'm the Chief Ministry Officer at South Texas Youth for Christ. So primary responsibilities is overseeing all the ministry sites that we lead and the staff and volunteers and leaders. Our mission is really to reach lost kids, help them to be in a loving Christ-centered relationship with a healthy adult. And then we really want to mobilize them to be lifelong followers or disciples who share their faith with their peers.
That's great. And so when it comes to that role, can you unpack more along the lines of like what your leadership duties entail?
Yeah, so working with my CEO on casting vision for the organization, we have a 5-year strategic plan. So we want to kind of reverse engineer where we feel God's calling us. So we work together on that. And then really I work with my ministry team to flesh out the objectives that, we've set along with our board. And so right now our focus is really in the next 5 years is to raise up 500 leaders to reach 5,000 kids. And so on the daily operation, I'm working with directors who oversee leaders and volunteers and just really championing them and supporting them and helping them to be the best versions of themselves that they can be.
That's great. And I know that being that you used to be a supervisor for me, I know that you have a very high attention to relational aspect of leadership, and you being in more of this established role with where you're at with Youth for Christ, South Texas. Could you give a little bit more of what it was like maybe early on? Because I think like a lot of young leaders, that's who we're really trying to talk to in this podcast. A lot of young leaders, they aspire to leadership and then they'll typically get it's almost like get overwhelmed at the thought of becoming the director of something or a 3-letter acronym of something, and they'll get discouraged or feel unqualified. Can you share what it was like for you at the very early stages of what it was like when you first started stepping into ministry leadership?
Yeah. So, and I think, I'll be honest, I never felt qualified to really do anything for Jesus that he's asked me to do. And so I
Same
think
here.
early, in my early walk with Jesus, it was just trusting him and walking that out and doing the best I could. And, I was intimidated by leadership and, the thought, I was probably more intimidated about the thought of failing. Like I didn't want to fail others, but I really didn't want to fail God. But I realized like I can't live my faith in a bubble, and so I had to step out. And so, and part of my past is I overcame a lot of trauma as a child, and so that mindset that I had to change early on was that, hey, God really can use me, and yes, I will be nervous, and yes, there will be challenges, but He's going to be with me, and I don't go alone. And so that's kind of been my encouragement through the years is like, whether it's in a new leadership role or whether it's serving a new school that, like right after the Uvalde shooting, we started a site there, and I had never started a site in the, aftermath of a mass shooting. And so very uncomfortable, lots of thoughts of, oh, I don't have what it takes. Am I going to fail? But really, I had to push past all that. And so I think the greatest thing I could probably encourage young leaders is, we're our worst critic. and can't listen to those voices or those tapes in our heads that tell us we don't have what it takes. And really, if Jesus is for us, we could accomplish it. And again, the promise is He goes with us. We're not doing it alone. So I don't know if that helps, but
Yeah, I think it's a really powerful thing to have this acknowledgement of fear of failure, this acknowledgement of even feeling insecure. And I think that that is more beneficial to have than the opposite of being of thinking that you're the best gift to God's earth. Like
yeah,
thinking that
yeah,
you're the best leader that anybody could have. And I really resonate with you too about walking into certain situations to where you feel like, man, maybe I'm I'm not the right person for this. And I remember even being from in recovery myself and having a past of addictions of drugs and alcohol. I remember a moment where I was asked to speak at this recovery event to people in recovery for drugs and alcohol, and feeling insecure, like, well, maybe I wasn't, maybe I'm not that recovered, or maybe my addictions weren't good enough. It's like this really simple, like silly train of thought to where we disqualify ourselves in our head. And at the end of the day, I think that when we make it spiritual and go back to God and say, well, God, you made this opportunity possible, so I'm going to just rely on you to speak through me, is a really simple but powerful thing to do, that God leads us in. And for a practical note, could you share like what your first leadership role was once you gave your life to Christ?
yeah. So right after I gave my life to Christ, I went to the youth pastor. I started volunteering in youth, and so I guess that was my first role, was a youth worker. And I went to him and said, "Hey, I really want to work with at-risk kids." And he said, "All right, I'll champion you." And so he got behind me and helped me over the next year to create a program and get volunteers to really work with at-risk kids. And I'd say that was my first official like title, because then I was the leader of that group. And so,
That's
and
great. And it sounds like you really had a great leader over you to help champion you, like you said. And I think that that would resonate with a lot of aspiring leaders, to where not in all churches, but a lot of churches are really capped in their ability when it comes to leadership, to where they have so many different people saying, "I want to do this, I want to do that," to where a lot of times they get like this over spiritualized answer of, "Well, you need to wait on God." And it's like I think it's more so that you just don't know where to put them, and so many great potential leaders are on the back burner thinking that God told them to wait to do something, when in reality is just like they need a better outlet to find that ministry, to be able to find a place to where they could be useful. And
yeah,
on that same note, and there's definitely times where people need to wait, don't get me wrong, but
yeah.
um, on that same note, now that you've been in leadership for such a long time, what would you say, looking backwards, has been one of your greatest obstacles?
Well, I think that early on, that mindset of, I don't know if I have what it takes, going from, I think this fixed mindset of like, oh, this is just who I am, and I'm always going to be this way, to like, oh no, God, I can change. God will give me strengths and gifts, and yeah, that stepping out and walking it I think that was the tension of like, okay, some He's naturally gifted me, but some He's going to develop in me as I walk. He's not going to just sit back and prepare me. It's as I go. And so I think trusting that process, trusting God, that you know, just stepping out and then taking the next step and taking the next step. And I think that mindset of, like, I think, I think a lot of times, we see problems and we want to fix all day long. I think we're kind of looking to, protect ourselves and take care of ourselves. And that's good, right? We need to survive. But I think that can also work against us if we're constantly looking, to protect ourselves, or, oh, look to solve this problem. Sometimes that fear can inhibit us. And so I think the greatest challenge is that I've learned to overcome is I'm always going to have fear. Like, it's
Yeah.
never going to go away. I still just have to step into it and face it and go through it.
Yeah, I think that especially with anxiety being like the number one uh, mental health word that's used among young people today, it becomes a big label over their minds and hearts. And no, I deal with anxiety too, just like everyone else. But I think that people have gotten so in their heads to where they talk themselves out of great meaningful opportunities because they just, it's like almost like they overthink it and they think about it
Mhm.
too hard, and they start thinking of all the reasons that could go wrong, or of why it won't work out, and then they get this, it's like this fear fantasy instead of like a
Mhm.
fantasy of hope. It becomes this fantasy of fear, to where it's so detrimental that they talk themselves out of something really great. And that's a huge obstacle for so many people to overcome. I love that. On the twist of that kind of vein, what would you say is something that you're most proud of after all these years?
Yeah, I think really overcoming my, with Christ, I've been able to hopefully walk hand in hand with him to be the best version of myself. And I think stepping through that and walking out when maybe others weren't doing it, or just that fear. I think that overcoming, and I liken it to that when we receive Christ, I believe we have to be broken to a place where we're willing to accept him. And I think that brokenness, I think part of us is we want to kind of let it go. Like, okay, now I've been walking with Jesus for a while. I don't need to be broken anymore. So when you say being the most proud, to be honest, I'm the most proud that I was broken enough to allow Jesus to be my hope, not just for salvation, not just for, um, heaven someday, but for here and now. Like,
Yeah.
some of those lies are true. Like, there is times that in and of myself, I'm not going to have what it takes, but with Christ, I do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. It's I would equate to what you're describing is even like the having the gift of faith, and um and just really believing God to show up in those moments that you need him, and to really supply whatever ability it is that you may need, or opportunity, whatever, etc. Um if as long as you make yourself available. And I think that's a really powerful testament to young aspiring leaders, because sometimes I feel like we often take faith out of the equation, and we try to make everything perfect, everything ready, and try to go to as much school as we can, and those are all great things, and it's good to try to be as equipped and prepared as we can. But sometimes I feel like we just take faith out of the equation when we feel like God's trying to tell us to do something, and we keep using preparedness as a avenue to postpone what God's really trying to tell us to do. So that's powerful. Um, and on that note, you're when it comes to leadership, you're overseeing so many different leaders now, and there's so many moments in which you are within your organization, you're bringing in new people. What would you say are characteristics or skills that you look for someone to either join or move ahead?
Yeah, I think, and this is just me, but kind of in that same vein of like, I think I look for somebody, and some people don't like the word broken, so like maybe like fractured or dependent, but somebody who's truly dependent on God. Like, I think we can be humbly confident,
Hmm.
and so looking for that humility. Like, I really believe that, humility is, it's hard to define. I think when we see it, we understand it, but it's really hard to define, because then if you say you're humble, like now you're not humble anymore. And so identifying that humility, and again, going back to like that being broken is, okay, I'm humble in the fact that maybe I don't have all that I need for what this job might require, but I am confident in the fact that God will help me. And so then I also look for somebody who's really collaborative. Like, we really want team players. And so I believe that as believers, the gospel comes in, we receive the gospel, and we exchange our power for God's power, and that takes humility. And then when we learn to ask for help and work together, that collaboration, then that's where the body of Christ comes together. So I think those are the two greatest elements to look for in a potential leader.
Yeah, that's great. And I feel like a big of part of what you're describing is even being teachable
Mhm.
and and being able to learn and grow. And it's so much easier to work with people who are in a sense moldable and willing to learn like that. And especially when it comes to working together. And I think that a lot of times when people are early on in ministry, we get this kind of like lone wolf mentality, like it's me against the world and I'm gonna shine. And it's especially now when most young people's I just saw a statistic the other day that the number one dream job among Gen Z is to become a social media influencer. And I think that it's within the same vein, like so many Christians end up just or so many young people end up becoming a Christian and just taking what they want and then labeling it with God. And now it's like, well, before I wanted to be an influencer, but now I want to be a Christian influencer. It's like now you just, I think all you're doing now is trying to use God as a means to an end. You still want the same thing, and to really understand that any level of spotlight that you have is vanity in comparison to the collaboration you can make with others and being able to make a real difference. And it's not you against the world, but that this is this idea of kingdom mentality that we're trying to work together. It's so powerful. Hey listeners, today I'm reaching out for your support to keep our journey of innovative Christian leadership alive. Every week we dive into territories of faith-based leadership because of the contributions made by people who believe in this mission. Whether you want to help us by becoming a monthly supporter or by submitting a one-time donation, you help fuel our discussions on authentic and practical leadership. Your generosity allows us to help other leaders just like yourself harness their creativity for the greater good of our communities and beyond. As a monthly supporter, you can submit questions and comments to be shared on the show each week, and you'll also get weekly shout-outs on air for being a member. And if you become a super supporter, you will receive a monthly free product from our online store. To support us, please visit homerhargrove.com and look for the support section. It's quick, it's easy, and every bit of it helps us to make greater impact to Christian leadership. Thank you for being a part of our mission. Now, let's get back to today's episode. On that note, say someone is just starting out, what kind of advice would you give to them if you were to even look back at yourself years ago and you're able to give yourself a piece of advice? What would be one piece of advice you'd give to someone starting out?
Um, well, I think, can I answer that two parts? So
Yeah,
one
of
would be for
course.
maybe a younger person now, because I agree with you. You know, we work with a lot of young leaders. We work with middle school, high school leaders and college age leaders. And, you know, I'll be honest, most of them are better with their phone than I am. Like when it comes to social media and all that, like they are better with their phone and the information. And really this generation is the first generation, more millennials, but was the first generation known history to not only have the information, but to be qualified in the dissemination of it. And so a young person starting off, I think the biggest challenge I see is young people do have all these giftedness with the technology and all the information. And yeah, they're probably better than their bosses at most of that. But you gotta temper that with the fact that the older generations have wisdom. You know,
Yeah.
you can Google a lot of stuff, you know, and now they say now teenagers are actually TikToking everything. They don't even Google as much. So you can do that, but you never know what you're going to find.
Yeah.
True wisdom comes through experience. And so that's what I'd say to a young person is be confident in your abilities there, but be teachable in all those other areas.
Yeah.
Because you know, you might have Googled like how to build a resume or how to do that, but it could be wrong. Like,
Yeah.
and so, but then to go back to my future self, I'd probably say to enjoy, to really be focused on enjoying the journey and not being so
Mm,
focused on the destination. Because I think early I thought, oh, if I can get there or be leading people like this or be, you know, I didn't want to be an influencer, but if I could just have that position or that title, I will be fulfilled.
yeah.
And as soon as I got that next, it was like a moment, and it's like, oh, and that's where through all those transitions, I had to find my identity in Christ, not in what I do.
Wow. That's really powerful. And to complement those answers, um, the idea of finding value in your position is insatiable, in the fact that you'll always want the next thing. And it makes me think a lot about like parenthood. Like when my kids are babies, I'm like, oh my God, I can't wait till they're older and
Yeah.
they can wipe their own butts and take care of themselves. And then like just these little steps that they start making, and you start to think like, oh my gosh, they'll never need me to wipe their butt again. Like it's like just a surreal moment of realizing to enjoy the journey, like you said, to enjoy this time, because you will not get it back. And I think back to my 20s and ministry time that I did, knowing that I will never be that again. I will never be in my 20s again, and I will never be a youth pastor again. I mean, God willing, not God willing, but
Yeah.
it's this idea that to enjoy those moments of ministry, because when things change, they most likely will change forever, and you won't be going, not quote unquote backwards, but you won't be going back to these same things that you once did all the time. And the idea with Gen Z and their ability for technology, I remember a moment when I was still a youth pastor, and a question being brought up and me thinking, well, I don't really know. And then a kid just pulling out their phone and searching it and like, oh, this is the answer. And I was like, oh, I just didn't even consider to use my phone to look for that. It's like they experienced technology at such a young age. It's like equivalent to someone as an adult learning Spanish versus someone as a baby learning Spanish. Like it's just their minds are so much more moldable to where it becomes normal to them at such a young age. And it is could be very self-destructive in the sense of thinking that they know everything. And I've had plenty of times to where I'm here a pastor of a church and leading and having a person younger than me saying, well, what about when the Bible says this? And me having the experience of reading scripture, understanding hermeneutics, understanding so much depth when it comes to studying scripture, and then taking all this time to explain it, and then them just respond, say, well, this says that. Oh, I saw a YouTube video and this guy said this. And it's like, well, if you want to trust your YouTube video over me, then go ahead. But you're only setting yourself up to whatever kind of muddy fountains that are out there. You have no idea what they what they're really putting into their content, where they're deriving it from. And so often young people end up regurgitating all of these different teachers and preachers and turn their philosophy and ideology into this Frankenstein of a belief, to
Mhm.
where they don't even realize that they're pulling from paganistic ideas. They're pulling
Yeah.
from these ideas of crystals and Buddhism. It's like they just morphing it all together because it all sounds right. It sounds good. And they don't even realize that they have developed this new age philosophy, and yet they believe they're this, Christian with a manipulated idea of Christ. And I
Mhm.
think the best example I experienced was uh, was I told somebody, you've read about casting out a demon, but I've actually cast out a demon. That's where you don't understand what it's really like until you experience it
Mhm.
yourself. And that's that gap I feel like you're describing when it comes to Gen Z and even millennials too. And in that on that vein, if you were to go backwards, what you describe what kind of advice you would give, what would be a question that you wished you would have asked early on?
Yeah, so I think what you're, kind of for me is getting at is like we can have information, but actually, you know, that doesn't lead to change. It's when you apply that information that
Yeah.
transformation happens. I tell my team that like applied information is transformation. And I think that's part of something I'd go back to my earlier self and say is like it's both and like I want to be driven and I want to grow and I want to, push the limits of who I can be with Christ, but I also want to apply the things that he's teaching me. And some of that application, that's the slow process. I can download information. I mean, I can get all the information I want. I feel like I did something. I feel like I've grown because I added to my information. And my experience with Jesus is he's like, oh, hey, I want to teach you about humility. It's not, you're not just going to read 5 articles on it. Like this is going to be
Yeah.
a month, 2 months, 3 months. And so I would encourage myself like, hey, again, value the information, but applied information leads to that transformation. You do that long enough, you have wisdom. And
Yeah.
that's where I think a lot of the generation and every generation before lacks the wisdom of what you're saying. Like, yeah, I had that information, I applied it, led to transformation. And here's my, because of that experience, I have wisdom.
Yeah.
And I just see this generation is trying to microwave it. And you just can't microwave the process.
Yeah.
Just can't. So,
Yeah, that's a incredibly powerful concept. And comparing it to like microwaving it, would you rather a microwaved cake or an oven baked cake? And so often we try to just get these fast results. And I find that the the anticipated time that most young leaders starting out think that something will take is usually a fraction of what it really takes. They think, oh, well, I'll probably be ready for full-time ministry within 6 months. It's like maybe like yeah, as far as like really, really being ready, like maybe 6 years. Maybe
yeah.
like you'll really start understanding what you're doing after 6 years. But we have such a shorter time frame in our mind of what it really takes to make something happen or to fully develop ourselves. It doesn't mean that we have to wait all that time to start getting started, but it's this idea of grasping humility and trying to learn from a mentor these ideas of experience. And I think that, I think that in that same thought too, with getting a mentor, so many Gen Z and even millennials settle for a virtual influencer to be their mentor, someone that they have no relationship with, but that's where they pull all of their advice. They search their videos for encouragement. They are trying to get this synthetic form of mentorship through social media, and it is just like you said, this microwaved idea of it. But what you really need is this relational mentor that can help you and help you grow through their experience. They end up catapulting you forward instead of you having to, in a sense, learn the hard way. And so with that thought, when it comes to leadership and ministry, what is one of the greatest changes that you have made as a leader?
Well, I think, looking back, I thought leadership, if I could get a position, then I'd be a leader. And then I realized like, no, leadership is influence. Positions can help your influence, but it doesn't make you a leader. So I really worked hard on being a Christian leader. And now I think the biggest thing I can do is reproduce leaders. So is raising up leaders who have that emphasis to raise up other leaders. And that takes, you talk about a longer process. That's a longer process. Um, and I think it also it's not just slower, but I think I have to have my information and that process kind of mapped out. And so,
Yeah.
for example, that recently, that's why I wrote a book. Was I was doing all these one-on-one meetings, developing leaders, and then I was like, well, wait a minute, if I could do this, write a book, then maybe I could multiply more leaders.
Mhm.
And so, I think it's just that growth of, okay, now I want that next challenge of seeing multiplication, not just addition. So.
Yeah, that's a powerful idea of leadership is that you don't want just in a sense followers. You want to produce other leaders so that you can extend the impact that's being made. And that's a great plug. Can you tell us a little bit about your book that you just came out with?
Yeah, so I just went through a few years of some really hard challenges in my marriage, and then I got rear-ended, got post-concussion syndrome. So I went through these hard processes, and I realized like I don't have anything to leave my kids. Like if something would have happened, I don't have like a Bible I wrote thousands of notes in because I'm on my, they could get my phone. And so I started writing a book for my son at that time on Christian leadership. I was going to call it Kingdom Leadership for him. And I was getting into it. God started saying, hey, Chuck, I want you to write this for the other leaders you're going to be developing. So he kind of tricked me. I never really wanted to write a book, but and so I started writing out the framework, which I've used for years. And then God told me to go secular with it. And so I was like, okay, God, if you want me to teach kingdom discipleship, kingdom leadership, because my book's all about how to be a leader that reproduces other leaders, discipleship, then I said, okay, Jesus, if you want me to do that in a secular way, I need a parable. And so that's where he gave me the parable of the atom, and that, the atom, can be harnessed for potential extreme results, whether that's an explosion or fusing together. And so that's the book is kind of like a parable on kingdom leadership, on how to grow exponentially as a leader yourself, but also how to work with others. So the two big ideas are in that is, and I kind of talked about, is being broken. In order for us to see nuclear results with the atom, it either has to be broken or fused. When we break is where we get the atom bomb. And so I believe as believers, as we go through our life, things are going to break us. And either we can press in and allow God to turn that into his power, or we can do it our own and less, a lot less results. And then the second part is really tapping into the power of working collaborative and working with others to harness more energy, more power than we would on our own. So
Yeah, that's incredibly powerful to consider. And I feel like really the distinction that you're making is the difference between a manager and a leader. And the tones that you're setting is really what drives beyond a positional leader, and the attributes and the heart that go along with it. I love that. That's really powerful stuff. And as a final question, as a little bonus question, what is leadership has so many different weights that we carry on our shoulders. It has so much responsibility. It can stress a lot of people out. What is something that you do to decompress as a leader?
So right now, currently, because I don't have a lot of margin in my life, I too have those little kids I'm taking care of, changing diapers, and wife and ministry, and then I have a business on the side. So I don't have a lot of margin. And so for the sake of my relationship with God, I chose to quit working out and going on walks. So now I get a time to go on a walk every night. It's a little long. It's a good chunk. It's an hour. And I take that time to walk and pray, and meditate. And that actually, I started that right after my accident. And now that I could work out, I don't want to, because I'm having just such an amazing time with God. And I'm not saying it's all like this mountaintop. A lot of it's just questioning and challenging. And so that's where I think my true power comes from, to handle the rest, is plugging into him. And I do it through nature, walks. And so that's my favorite time of the week, my favorite time of the day. So
That's beautiful, and especially having that moment of silence too on a walk. That can be a really liberating experience, especially with kids,
yeah.
especially. And I really resonate with that. And so, Chuck, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation. If anyone wants to connect with you, where could they find you?
I have a website at it's atomicleadership.org. And so, and on there,
Great.
my
And
contact information is on there. So
okay, great. And for people that want to purchase your book, can they find it there? Can they
yeah,
find
they
it
can
on
find it from the
Amazon?
website, or it's on Amazon, Atomic Leadership. So
Okay, great. Well, again, Chuck, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. I really appreciate you.
thanks, Homer.
Well, there you have it. I hope that this episode was meaningful and edifying for your leadership and your growth within your ministry and organization. Could you do me a favor? Could you leave a rating and review for this podcast? It'd really help me out and help others be able to see this show in their feed. You can also visit homerhargrove.com to be able to learn more, connect, or become one of our supporters. Until next time, have a great life.